Hello everyone, slightly ill Sientir here with another Rambler for you. And this one's going to be about social justice in kind of more of a meta sense. It's a topic that I want to talk about as itself, not rather the thing that it refers to necessarily. And before I do, however, I just want to note that this is going to be the last scheduled Rambler. Next week, I'm going to be starting a new series called Geekdom of God. I've learned a lot doing the Ramblers, and I really appreciate what I've learned from them, but I think it's time to have more of a focused niche. Something that I can feel passionate about that also has a very specific focus. So starting next week, like I said, I'm going to be doing a new series called Geekdom of God, which is going to basically just be a Christian theology-focused series. Hopefully this is something that can appeal to people, and it will be a more focused subject matter overall. And I think it will fit better for what I'm personally wanting to do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and launch into this topic. Now, like I said, I want to approach social justice from a meta sense, and this is partly inspired because my pastor has been talking about social justice, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but I have a problem. My problem is when I hear the term social justice, and this is a personal problem, to be clear. To me, that phrase is used to justify bigotry against heterosexual, cisgendered white men, which is what I am. When I hear the term social justice, what I hear is not, we need to try to make it so that way everybody's lives can be better, and that there's a lot of people who have things that are unjust happening in their lives that we need to address. What I hear is, I hate what I am, basically. That this other person hates what I am, and they want to justify that through the term of social justice. That's unfortunate, but there's unfortunately a lot of white people who hear that same sort of thing with the phrase social justice. So I want to just talk about some of the issues surrounding social justice in this regard. One of the big issues that I have with just the concept of social justice is I don't feel like it's been well defined what the goal specifically is. Like I said earlier, just a moment ago, make everybody's lives better or something like that, but a lot of it seems to be about social vengeance rather than justice. The difference being that revenge is trying to destroy other people. It's saying, you hurt me and I want to hurt you back, rather than saying, I want straight up justice. So one of the issues here is I perceive that there's different ideas of what it means for society to be just. And the other complication is there's a lot of solutions to make society more just in such and such person's eyes, but a lot of these solutions seem to be really simple, and they can also often be just as unjust. There's also something else that I think needs to really be discussed with this particular topic, something that often gets neglected, which is worldview perspectives. So I personally hate the terms white and people of color. I find them to be intrinsically divisive terms rather than unifying, but I do find that they usefully describe a couple of different worldviews. And I find both of these worldviews can have some serious problems. So the white view, the one that I'm familiar with, and this is what I've been having to kind of overcome, is that the world is operating as it's intended to operate, as it were. That is, racism is basically dead except for a few extremist edge cases. So this is going to be defining racism as very blatant stuff, very blatant bigoted behavior. And then it also, this particular view also establishes that all of the, quote, people of color, unquote, again, I don't like that term, but all of them complaining about things being unfair are just using their race as an excuse to not try hard enough. And then the other kind of point of view, the sort of people of color view, or this is what I kind of perceive it to be, and I could be very wrong here, is that their race has held them back and denied them opportunities that they would have had they been white instead. One of the things I think is a great tragedy also is when somebody feels they don't belong or they shouldn't exist because of their race. I think that's a serious tragedy. That's something that shouldn't happen. Or because of their culture, because their family has food that's different than, typical American fare, stuff like that. I think that's really, really sad. So there are a number of reasons why I call these problems perspectives. Most of what I'm going to focus on is kind of why this, quote, white view, unquote, has some serious problems. So there are deeply ingrained racial stereotypes that cause subconscious bias. Like, this is very much so the case. Some of these are race, some of these are cultural based. So things like what type of music people listen to can cause us to view each other differently based upon that sort of preference, how we talk, how we dress, things like that. Those tend to be more cultural than specifically race-based, but all of these things can contribute, as well as racial bias, subconscious bias, can cause some serious problems. That is a thing that is observable, that we have to be very conscious of trying to not let run roughshod over us. There's also, it's really important to recognize that historical racist policies and procedures, they have a lasting legacy, even after they've ended. A really good example of this is redlining, which is a policy that was enabled in a number of cities, unfortunately. And what it basically did is saying, well, it's not just redlining, but that's part of it. So the concept was to break up cities into different zones. Some zones were one color, other zones were another color. And what this basically said was, this is a good place to be, this is a bad place to be. And unfortunately, the process of redlining was basically saying, hey, African Americans live here, therefore this property is worth less. This area is a bad place to be. And this process, unfortunately, caused a lot of stores to not be established in these redlined areas. This policy is no longer in place, but the consequences of it still are. We have to be aware of these sorts of things. Something else that is really important is representation really does matter, and diversity is important. It can provide role models as well, which is significant. And role models, they're both inspiration, but they're also permission. That is, a role model existing basically says someone like you, that is, whatever the role model is representing, can be thing X, whatever sort of position they're in. And that is super important. It presents the idea of accomplishment to people. It gives them something to aspire to and be inspired by. And that's really important. I think that for a lot of us who are white, we don't realize how much this matters because we're used to seeing people that look like us everywhere. We're used to being told we can be anything. When you come from a culture that doesn't do that, it is very restrictive. And seeing this potential, this opportunity, seeing someone represent that you can be this thing, you can consider this path, can have a significant impact. I do know from personal experience that it can take some getting used to, this diversity thing, but I think it's worth it for others to feel included. It's interesting, just as kind of a personal anecdote on this, I have noticed more stuff with Magic the Gathering as they've been increasing their diversity, and sometimes that results in stuff that I'm not as preferential to. Some of that's aesthetics. There are certain aesthetics that I particularly like, and there's others that I'm not as fond of, and, that's a personal thing. And I'm willing to have something that I'm maybe not quite as fond of be there, so that way people who it really is meaningful to can have it. I think that's important, even if it does take some getting used to. It is worth it to get used to it. On the other hand, there are times where race doesn't factor into what happens to a person. And it's important that personal faults and failings aren't blamed all the time on the race, right? That personal faults and failings are not a symptom of race. They're a symptom of behavior. And so having a clear delineation is really important. Blaming everything on race is just not going to be accurate all of the time. And hopefully people aren't doing that, but it certainly can feel like that's happening sometimes. And all I'm saying here is I think it's important to step back and say, wait, is this really because of my race? Or is this because of something that I've actually done? Is this some sort of behavioral thing, something like that? And maybe the answer is it is because of race, but it might also be behavior. This is just something that seems important to kind of try to evaluate because otherwise it's really easy to be dismissive of things that are actually going on, behaviors that are actually causing problems. It can be very complicated though, because some of the behavioral stuff can be a product of culture that is just culture clashing, and that becomes extremely difficult to figure out as well. So, speaking of culture, something else is that there are some cultural patterns that have better results than others. That is saying, cultures have different ways of operating, and certain cultures have patterns of behavior ingrained into them, built into them, that have better results in the society at large than other patterns of cultural behaviors. So this is something that I feel like can be observed from observable data. Like you can observe that this happens. A really good example is that if people feel like they don't have hope that they can escape a situation they know to be bad, then they often will just submit to that situation to try and reduce suffering. For example, if it seems like the only way to get ahead in life is to become part of a gang, then that's what people are going to do. It's not great. It's pretty much awful. But if there's no hope of escape, if that seems to be the best avenue to be able to have a better life, then that's what people are going to try to do. And that's unfortunate. That's where we need to provide hope in those situations. Also, solutions to legitimate problems are going to be really difficult to implement through attacking type behavior, especially ones that feel based in bigotry. So kind of what I'm saying here, and this, just to be clear, it applies to kind of both sides of social justice arguments. If we're trying to attack each other to advance our position, it's not really going to work. Like, at the end of the day, everyone has problems. Everyone wants a better life, and basically everyone wants to give their children a better life than they had. Just as a quick aside, this does create what we call privilege, because if we give our children a better life than we had, then they are more privileged than us, as it were. one of the things that's difficult is this world isn't fair. Different people have different giftings, different abilities, that sort of thing. We're born into situations that we have no control over. I think that's part of what makes things so difficult. So to kind of conclude my personal thoughts on like what I would see as the goal of social justice is to do our best to enable individuals and communities to maximize their potential, to make sure no unreasonable barriers based on immutable characteristics are put in place. And just kind of a quick aside, there are sometimes reasonable barriers. These are going to be rare, but it's going to be things like sometimes with certain acting roles, there's going to be reasons for certain restrictions. For example, if a character is supposed to be female, probably should be played by a female. If a character is supposed to be male, should probably be played by a male. Things like that, because there's some amount of significance to those roles. But it's important to try to have diversity in casting, so the barriers are probably not quite as tight as we tend to make them. But the final goal, I think, is to try to acknowledge the common dignity of humanity, of us all, right? And that, to me, seems like what the goal of social justice should be. But it's going to be really hard to try to advance, to try to progress in these sorts of things through attacks. And unfortunately, one of the big problems that I see, especially on Twitter, is that a lot of what's happening is people are trying to call each other stupid idiots and not try to have a conversation, not try to advance stuff, and not try to figure out how to solve the actual problems that exist. And instead, it's all a bunch of posturing, which is really frustrating because people's lives could be getting better, and instead we're screaming at each other, and it's not helping. Trying to do things to unify rather than divide is probably going to be more long-term successful here, to show the common humanity in us all, to try to emphasize that, and also to help make people aware of what the actual problems are. What are the situations that are happening? How can we present this in a way that is calm and clear? And how can we do it in a way that doesn't make the other side, as it were, feel like they're being attacked? So, those are some of my thoughts. Hopefully I've not knocked over a powder keg, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on this subject, because it is a difficult one. I really wish that the phrase social justice didn't feel like an excuse to justify bigotry against my immutable characteristics. I think that's unfortunate, and it makes it hard for me to take anything following that phrase seriously, because it feels like it's an attack on me. That's a tragedy, and unfortunately, I don't think I'm alone in that. Hopefully, we can, as a species, unify as one human race and not try to subdivide ourselves, not try to separate ourselves, but respect the common dignity of us all. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. You can email me directly at sientir@gmail.com. You can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/sientirsramblers. And you can support me financially at patreon.com/sientir. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.